the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, a pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce our guest today, we just want to mention we do have a Patreon account, patreon.com/MUHH. If you can, consider dropping us $1 a month there, or if not, leave us a review on iTunes. But today we have Matthew Flisfeder, Associate Professor of Rhetoric and Communications at the University of Winnipeg, where he teaches courses on communication theory, popular culture, critical theories of discourse and ideology, and critical studies of social media. And today we have brought Matthew on to discuss his work, Algorithmic Desire. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today, Matthew. We're really looking forward to discussing your book. This is something that's very near and dear, a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, having studied social media for my graduate degree. And then I think it's actually funny because this is a way that actually Taylor and we actually met through Twitter. We can kind of talk about this a little bit, but it's kind of ironic that a lot of my in real life friends, including my current roommate, I have met on Twitter. So
no, it's interesting. Thanks for having me on, guys. I'm really looking forward to having our conversation. It's interesting the way that the IRL and the online worlds are bridging in this new internet of not internet of things, but internet of people now.
Cooper and I do, because as you pointed out, and as everyone knows, there could be a lot to be said about how social media can be immiserating, but then there are these nice opportunities to meet people I don't want to use the tired trope of networking, but it's nice to, when you have those encounters and meet new people. And I came across your book when I saw someone else tweeting about it and saying they were going over it with their students and how they found it interesting. And so, I was able to get a copy, look through it and say, I really think this is cool. And then I saw that you were on Twitter. So that's another way that it was just an easy way that we could interact without having to go through other channels. So, there are still positive aspects to social media. And I think that that's part of one of the threads of your book, right, which we'll get to in a moment. I know that we always like to start with sort of the origin story of your interest in the many things you're interested in. Obviously, social media is one thing that's just omnipresent, but more so in terms of perhaps theory, Lacanian psychoanalysis, Marxist theory. Do you have some anecdotes or anything you want to tell us about how you sort of got into philosophy and all these other things that you bring together in this book?
First, I have to say that the idea of origin stories, I want to feel like a superhero, but I don't know if it'll be as exciting as that. Yeah, sure. It's nothing crazy or out of the ordinary. I had spent most of my undergraduate and early graduate studies focused mostly on film and media and popular culture. I think from my undergraduate, I'd always been really interested in a lot of the British screen theory that was influenced by Louis Althusser. And I think it was really initially via Althusser that I became interested in Marxism, although I remember very much early on in my second year of university, I had a wonderful professor of a course on film culture and society that really did a great job of introducing some of the, classic Marxist theory of base and superstructure, reproduction of the means of production, interpolation of subjectivity. And that always, really fascinated me. And I was very fascinated in the way that you could think about that through the analysis of film and culture. But there was always something about Althusser's theory of interpolation and subjectivity that didn't really sit well with me. I mean, I was sitting there thinking, well, how does ideology zap itself into the mind? How does that process really function? How does it really work? So it was really around in the middle of my master's degree that I discovered sublime objective ideology, and I got interested in Zizek's work. So that by the time I was in my doctoral studies, I sort of realized that what I wanted to do was to think about Zizek's writing on film, cinema, popular culture as a way to kind of rejuvenate a lot of what the early screen theorists, so I'm talking about people like Laura Mulvey, Stephen Heath, Colin McCabe, Peter Woolen, those folks, even some of the French precursors like Christian Metz. I was really trying to think about how Slavoj could resuscitate what they were trying to do in terms of theories of ideology and subjectivity in the cinema. Now, the other thing to remember is I also have a background in cultural studies and the work of Stuart Hall, particularly his very famous essay, Encoding, Decoding, which I take up in the social media book. That had a huge influence on me as well in thinking through the Althusserian problematic about, again, what happens in situations of failed interpolation. That was something that was very fascinating and interesting to me. So my doctoral work was focused on using Zizek's work to revive and resuscitate a kind of Lacanian Marxist theory of ideology via the cinema. Now, the other thing is that when I was defending my doctoral dissertation, it was the person that I had started reading more because her work was really being taken up in media and communication studies, which is my background, is the work of Jodi Dean. And she ended up being the external examiner on my doctoral dissertation. And I started reading more and more. I graduated roughly around the time that her book Blog Theory came out, and I was very fascinated and influenced by that book. But there were some points of disagreement that I had with her understanding of the Lacanian categories of desire and drive, and specifically the idea of the demise of symbolic efficiency, which she takes up via Zizek, and I take up in relation to Frederick Jameson. So it was really through her influence and trying to build off of what she was doing, but also in some kind of a disagreement with her, write about social media. So it was immediately after I finished working on my film book, on Zizek and film, which is based on my doctoral dissertation, that I immediately thought I want to try to think about what I was doing with film, but in relation to social media, and in part as a response to the great work that Jodi Dean was doing, but also, again, in a kind of a comradely disagreement with some of the, I guess, more esoteric, but I still think vital dimensions to her theoretical approach to internet culture, blog culture, and social media in general. And then again, I've been active on social media since MSN Messenger and Facebook and all of those things. So it just seemed like a fit. And at the time, that was something that I was really interested in and I wanted to think about beyond the standard sort of political economic critiques of social media that we saw in a lot of the 2000s, not just with Jodi Dean's work, but also people like Christian Fuchs. I thought that what we were missing was a good philosophical and theoretical understanding of social media as ideology. So that's, I guess you could say, is the origin story of the work.
I do think it's great to see that trajectory, especially with the notion of this question of symbolic efficiency, which is animating the opening chapters. And, that was something that gave me a lot of pause of thinking through one of the threads of the book, which comes out as you pose it provocatively, but you also tarry with it and you kind of give maybe some qualifications, which is this question about how social media does not exist in the way in which the Lacanian big other does not exist. Is this something that you develop out from this notion of this loss in symbolic efficiency, as you've pointed out? This idea of social media does not exist, which was, to me, that stood out, and I thought it was brilliant. I guess that would be something I would want to talk through, because I found that fascinating about this tension between that sort of that knowledge on the one hand, but on the other hand, this perpetual need to kind of resurrect the quote unquote big other in order to allow for these coordinates in which desire and enjoyment can sort of take place.
Let me just speak to that for a second, because I think there's a few overlapping threads when we're talking about this notion of a demise of symbolic efficiency, or I think Dean refers to it as a decline of symbolic efficiency, beginning in her book Publicity's Secret, which is kind of a critique, I would say, of Habermas and the idea of the public sphere and communicative action, or communicative rationality, or communicative rationalism. And I think that's where Dean comes up with her idea of communicative capitalism as a retort to Habermas's communicative rationalism. Beginning in there, she talks about some demise of or decline of symbolic efficiency. But I also think about it not just, she takes it up from, it's a section near the end of Zizek's 1999 book, The Ticklish Subject. But I also think that it's helpful to read it through the way that somebody like Frederick Jameson has understood postmodernism, in some ways through a Lacanian lens, and also grappling with some of the central tenets to Louis Althusser's theory of ideology. So in Jameson's postmodernism work, initially the very famous essay Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, which he then later expanded into a book. In that work, he calls it it's from Lacan's notion of psychosis or schizophrenia, and he's taking it, of course, from Deleuze and Guattari here, that Lacan describes psychosis as a breakdown of the signifying chain. So in some ways, what you have is the Lacanian the symbolic order, as the field of language, meaning, understanding, representation, that there's something that takes place in postmodernism, culturally, or postmodernity historically. You can kind of get it in that very famous, statement from Jean-François Lyotard to understand postmodernity or postmodernism as an incredulity towards grand narrative or big narrative history. It kind of overlaps in the postmodern moment with a lot of the railing against, the central underlying points of signification that tie meaning and language and understanding and history all together. And both on the left and the right in postmodernity, you have this challenge, to ideology, to, the theories of the end of ideology, end of history, that we no longer have big grand narratives of history. We just have local parallel, little minor narratives of history. We move away from the macro politics to micropolitics in Foucault and so forth. So when Jameson's describing postmodernism as a breakdown of the signifying chain, even, the undermining of, phallocentric authority, patriarchal authority, that the breakdown of the signifying chain is a way of describing how we no longer have this, universal central point or target against which we're railing, that everything exists in parallel with each other. In an interesting way, Jameson uses this as a kind of a retort to Althusser, because in Althusser's theory of ideology, he describes ideology as an imaginary representation of the subject to its real conditions of existence. So you have in that phrase the two dimensions of the Lacanian imaginary and the real, but as Jameson points out, the symbolic goes missing. So what he tries to do with his notion of cognitive mapping, in a way, is a return to the form of the symbolic, but at the level of the interpretation, which if you read it through his other work, Political Unconscious, for instance, what we're missing is we need a return to big narratives of history, that when he says always historicize, it's almost a call to return to a way to not regain the symbolic order in the sense that, you have it in liberalism or in capitalism, but that what the Marxist project, the socialist or the communist, whatever you want to call it, project requires is an historical narrative that allows people to position themselves within existing conditions, but in the broader scheme. I don't want to go on too long, but I think that this is an important background to understanding then how Zizek takes up this idea of demise of symbolic efficiency in the Ticklish Subject, because one of the things he says, and the chapter that opens where that line comes from, is a critique of Foucault and Judith Butler, and he has this statement, he says that perversion is not subversion. Right. And I think that you get the sense of it when you understand in the Lacanian sense that so much of the logic of perversion has to do with forms of resistance. But part of that form of resistance is you require still some target against which you're resisting. So there's a dimension of perversion in its masochistic and even its sadistic forms where you have to put in place some figure of authority against which you can resist. And that's still something that helps to propel your desire. Now, this is where you can get the difference between my approach and the approach of Jodi Dean, because her argument is this idea that, from her perspective, she argues that the demise of symbolic efficiency exists, and therefore nobody any longer believes in the authority of the symbolic order or the big other. From her perspective, we all already accept that the big other does not exist, which is in fact the Lacanian way of understanding the end of analysis. As Zizek argues in places like For They Know Not What They Do, what happens at the end of analysis when we accept that the big other no longer exists, we move from a logic of desire into one of drive. Drive is the way in which we relate to our enjoyment at the point at which we realize that the object of desire is itself impossible and we can continue desiring, but in the form of the drive. Now, for me, this is a little bit problematic if we all already accept that the big other no longer exists and that ideology is a mechanism, is organized around a mechanism of drive, then it almost to me reads as a way of saying that ideology is no longer a problem. And I think that to some extent, that might be true in the sense that in postmodern conditions, we've all become sort of realists, capitalist realists, if you want to use the Mark Fisher term, in the sense that we're not really duped by ideology. We know that there are big problems of economic exploitation. We know that there are problems of racism and heterosexism and fascism and all of these things, environmental problems. Who is not aware of all of these things, right? The problem is, and this is something that Zizek explains early on in Symbolium Objective Ideology, the problem is we know all of this, but nevertheless, we continue to act as if we didn't. That's the logic, the fetishistic logic and perversion of je sais bien, mais quand même, I know very well, but nevertheless. So part of my argument here in thinking about this idea of the demise of symbolic efficiency is tied to the way that in the form of perversion, we are all, in a sense, willing back into existence the form of the big other on social media platforms. So just to, and you asked, it seems like a small question, but you asked a very big question. So I want to get back to the point. No, I'm sorry, because I know I go on it a lot, and you'll have to get a big hook and drag me off the stage here. But I do want to get to the point you raised, because you asked about this overlap between my statement, social media doesn't exist, the big other doesn't exist, and even when Laclau and Mouffe, they say that society, they have, it's sort of like a weird mirroring of Margaret Thatcher, right? They say society doesn't exist, or they say that society is not a valid object of discourse. I think that the benefit of Slavoy's reading, I see Slavoj because he's a friend, but Zizek's reading of this situation is that it's not simple enough. It's too simple to say that society doesn't exist or the big other doesn't exist, because what we have to grasp is the reason why there's an impossibility of having a full, complete closure, even in the old, I'm going to be reductive, but in the old 20th century version of Hegelian Marxism, this notion of reconciling into a completed totality at the end of history, that this is impossible insofar as, well, for one thing, ontologically, if we understand reality as itself impossible and always incomplete, but politically, in the way that the class struggle is a sign of the political contradiction at the heart of the social. So that when we say society doesn't exist in the way that Laclau and Mouffe do, for instance, we should add to that it doesn't exist as a complete closed whole, because it is always fissured by political antagonism and contradiction in the form of the class struggle. So when I say that social media doesn't exist, it's an overlap with this idea of society doesn't exist in the way that Laclau and Mouffe and Zizek elaborate on. It's also a way to say that the big other doesn't exist. The problem for us is that ideologically, we continue to act as if it did exist, because it's one of the ways in which our access to our enjoyment via the resistance against some kind of authority, in some sense the symbolic order, helps to procure it in that logic of desire. I hope some of that made sense. I know that I said a lot of things there.
I thought that was great, actually. And I know that one of the reasons why it was a big question, but I think that so much of this is really necessary to get us a ground level to begin diving deeper into your argument. And so what I liked about this notion of Zist is the fact that you deploy social media in a number of ways in terms of a signifier, which is one of the questions I had about the signifier for the sort of hegemonic ideology. You also, and that's a question obviously we can get into at some point. Another big question, that's just a broad topic for us to discuss. I liked how bookended your book is, sort of on both ends, begins with this notion of the question of remaining faithful, not giving up on Not giving up on the social media metaphor, right? Not giving up on the social in social media, because there is a tendency to see social media as antisocial, but as you kind of pointed out, it's sort of the driving antagonisms of capitalism that's antisocial. And so I guess that would be a related question, if you feel it's related, this notion of sort of accelerating the metaphor of social media, not giving up, not ceding ground relative to the desire for quote unquote social media.
It's a great question. I love that question because it makes me feel like some of the provocations I develop in the book are actually hitting.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So I guess the first thing to explain is that there's two different ways that I'm looking at social media in the book. And I think that there's a lot of work, and I'm kind of continuing it in some ways. There's a lot of work already on the materiality, the material and systemic and structural dimensions of social media as a material system, right? That is definitely a system that is basically organized in terms of the capitalist mode of production and the capitalist relations of production, and specifically in terms of the neoliberal policy regime and ethic towards subjectivity. So there's that material dimension of social media that I try to talk about and expand in some ways. But there's also, I think, an important rhetorical and discursive dimension to social media. And this is something that I was engaging in methodologically in the book, but something that having finished the book, I finished the book around 2019. And after finishing it, thinking more reflexively about the methodology that I was applying in my analysis here, that there's definitely, from my perspective, a dialectical form of investigation of the materiality of social media via the concept, or the metaphor, as I put it, of social media, in a way that helps to develop an immanent critique of social media. Because I think that when we use the term, the metaphor, the concept of social media, many of us, I guess, popularly, the idea is that social and social media is meant to signify that, we're interactive, we're engaged with each other, we're in dialogue with each other, we're having critical, rational debate, hopefully, right? That's the idea. We talk about social media, as opposed to, say, pre-internet media, television, the newspaper, which there is a degree of interactivity. You can always have letters to the editor in the newspaper. You can have call-in shows on TV and radio, but the pace and the spread of the interaction was limited compared to what we get on the internet. So there's a kind of a techno-utopianism that's implied in the very concept of social media. Now, there's, of course, a huge body of literature now that's trying to argue, and I don't think it's necessarily wrong, but trying to argue that social media is making us antisocial, that the platforms are turning us into big bad people who always want to just argue with each other and troll each other, and is making us angry and frustrated. And there's claims that we should just abandon the concept of social media because it's really not social at all. And the reason why I want to stick to the metaphor of social media, and why I say in the end that our goal should not be to abandon but to accelerate the metaphor of social media, is because I think that it's only via the concept, the metaphor, or the rhetoric of the social and social media that we're capable of building an immanent critique of the material problems in the system, to the extent that we can start to understand that our problem is not the platforms themselves. And I do think that it's worth pointing out that there are definite benefits, not only to social media platforms, but to algorithmic media and technology more generally, that the deeper we look into this, we see that the problems that we have with our social media platforms are not problems with the media or the technology, but they're problems with the political and economic, the mode of production under which they're being developed and organized, which is the capitalist mode of production. That's capitalism that's making us antisocial. It's capitalism, and neoliberal capitalism in particular, that's making us competitive and individualistic in many different ways, not just, the idea of being an entrepreneur of the self, or being the influencer, or live streaming, but even in the form of the troll. And if you think about the troll as an individual who's trying to build their reputation by tarnishing the reputation of other people, this is something that, reputation management is something that is very much a product of the cultural logic of neoliberal capitalism. For me, it's very important to stick to the concept of social media, because I think that without it, we would be less able to develop the kind of immanent critique that we require of the capitalist system. In some ways, I feel that there's a similar, it's similar to what I don't think it gets discussed enough. The way that Marx's Capital, right? Marx's Capital is often read as a political economy, at least in my field, in media and communication studies. People often read Marx's Capital as political economy or even critique of political economy. But I think that it's important to realize that what Marx is doing in Capital, maybe some will disagree, that what Marx is doing in Capital is not just a material analysis of the capitalist mode of production, but it's an immanent critique of bourgeois ideology, the bourgeois categories of freedom and equality, that if this is what bourgeois society is telling us is in existence, Marx's Capital is a materialist and an immanent critique of bourgeois ideology itself. You're saying that society is this. Well, materially it shows that we can't have freedom and equality because liberalism, which institutes capitalism, reproduces forms of exploitation that require inequality. So it's a way of showing through a dialectical and immanent materialist critique that bourgeois ideology is fissured with contradictions. And that's, I mean, not to compare myself to Marx, but methodologically, I think that there's something similar happening in algorithmic desire.
I do like that. And it actually, just that point of your way of seeing what is going on, that actually brings in relief some of the points you make about this. It's sort of this move from modernism with, I know that you're working with Jameson and a bunch of other thinkers, but this point about, say, modern art being anti-bourgeois and this move to postmodernism with all of its incumbent problems. That my point being was basically with this move from modernism to postmodernism, with this move towards, I guess, the context in which you develop your approach at the beginning of the book is contrasting your new structuralist approach, which sort of keeps room for subjects, keeps room for structures, and sort of revitalizes this thinking versus, say, some of the approaches of new materialisms or of assemblage theory or of accelerationism. I was wondering about just, without necessarily having to specify the lineage of all three of those, or just, I was really wondering about what you see as lacking perhaps in just the general sort of theoretical trend on the left, if you will, if I'm kind of contextualizing that correctly, and what is implied by the new structuralist in the subtitle of your book.
Yeah, no, I really, really appreciate that question. So, so I don't want to give the whole, genealogy of those concepts: new materialism, post-humanism, assemblage theory, accelerationism, all of those things, right? It's interesting because in hindsight now, most of the work that I'm doing right now is centered on trying to rethink a dialectical humanism, which of course is the arch enemy of structuralism, from Levi-Strauss to Althusser to many of the so-called post-structuralists, Foucault, Deleuze, Guattari, Derrida, and so forth. Now, this might sound, again, maybe folks disagree, but the way that I read structuralism, French structuralism of the 1960s, I guess you could put it, the way that Levi-Strauss puts it, is that the goal of the human sciences is not to construct, but to destroy the human subject. And I see that a lot in even the way that Louis Althusser describes, ideology produces the subject. Subjects are interpolated by ideology. The subject exists only within the structure of the discourse. This is something that's particular to Foucault. And I even think in Deleuze and Guattari, you see, huge influence on new materialist assemblage thinking, accelerationism, that you see again, that subject is conceived as a sort of an epiphenomenon of the developments within the structure. So the way that I understand, or the way that I try to describe a new structuralism, very much influenced by Zizek's work and his collaborators in the Ljubljana school, Mladen Dolar and Alenka Zupancic, is to think of the structure as an incomplete totality. To think about the structure as, as you said, what's lacking? Well, lack is, we should positivize the lack in this way to grasp the fact that, and this is part of this, going back to that idea of society doesn't exist because it's fissured by the political contradiction, that every structure is always fissured by contradiction. And in this way, subject is what emerges in the point of lack or contradiction within the structure. And I guess Mladen Dolar has a really great line in an old essay called Beyond Interpolation, where he says that for Althusser, subject is a product of ideology, but for Lacan, subject emerges where ideology fails. In the sense even of hysteria. Hysteria is a way of describing failed interpolation. So for me, when I talk about new structuralism, it's an attempt to try to get away from the notion of subject that is a byproduct or an epiphenomenon of the structure, and to think subject as the grasping of the moment of contradiction internal to the structure. That's a good chunk of it.
I think that's great. And, I know that I will want to circle back to this, but I also want to let Coop jump in, and I know he has some questions prepared and had some sections to look at in the book. If you're cool with just sort of dialoguing with us.
Yeah, for sure.
It's about.
Yeah. I wonder if it would be good perhaps to maybe this would be a good way to segue into kind of this difference between kind of how you see, because you do sort of agree that there's a machinic element to the social media and desire, but that it is sort of secondary. And I think that is maybe a way to move forward from kind of what you just went over in terms of this structuralism. Do you kind of agree there at all?
I agree.
Or is that jumping too far ahead? I want to, at least.
I think no. I absolutely. I think it's a great point to bring to raise that aspect.
Because I was thinking back to you kind of described this, and you mentioned Marx's fragment on machines from the Grundrisse, and this is something we had looked at in concert with Guattari's. What was it? It's not the fragment. What is that? It's machine and structure.
Yeah.
Machine and structure, and essentially the point or what kind of the synergy I saw with regard to Marx and Guattari here was the way that for Guattari and Deleuze, the like you're saying, kind of through Althusser, the subject is kind of like the residue of a process of ideological interpretation, perhaps for Althusser. For Deleuze and Guattari, it's about the desiring machine is primary, and then the subject is kind of the secondary residue that accretes at the kind of the edges of the desiring machine. And I sort of drew a comparison here in the way that Marx in that fragment on machines describes the way that sort of individuals or humans or the human operators or workers are sort of these things that kind of accrue at the gaps between each machine to kind of help them traverse that little, whatever that gap, that constituent
the conscious operators.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so I saw kind of a similarity there as far as this sort of being on the periphery of this primary process, which I guess would be capitalism, right? The generation of surplus value and surplus desire. Just to build on that, how do you see, I guess, these machinic processes fit versus ideology, and kind of what do you see about ideology that makes you, confident that it's more of a primary aspect? And I guess that involves class struggle, which you focus on quite a bit in the book as well. Have I given you enough?
Yeah, no, definitely. There's layers here, right? And there's, various points, there's various threads that are overlapping here. Now, I guess the difficult question to ask is, how do we assume priority in terms of, the Deleuze and Guattari from Thousand Plateaus in particular, that idea of machinic enslavement? How can we assume priority, that or the form of social subjection, which they also talk about in Thousand Plateaus? Maurizio Lazzarato develops it in different ways. And again, it's complicated. It depends on your starting point here. The central argument I want to make, and I guess this is where I differ from some of the assemblage theory, which to me reads as suggesting that what is called social subjection is seen to be a secondary process where individuals are interpolated out of a bigger machine, so that when we are interpolated as subjects, the argument is we are taken out of, it's a weird way of phrasing it, but machinic enslavement, as I understand it, it sounds bad, but it's actually the more positive sign that we should be included into this big mega machine that we're all contributing. However, I think that, again, it's a little too, I guess I would say it's a little too utopian for my liking, if I can put it that way. And I hope I'm not offending people by saying that, in the sense that I guess one way that I guess I would distinguish between Lacan, Hegel versus Deleuze and Guattari is, I do think that people often talk about there's no point of negation in the work of Deleuze, and I don't entirely agree with that, because I think that what you see in the work of Deleuze and Guattari in particular, I'm thinking about the Capitalism and Schizophrenia books specifically, is it almost seems as there's an ethic of still constant negation, that there's forms of power that are interpolating us out of this machinic assemblage that we have to negate so we can return back to this flat, what's the Delanda term, flat ontology, that we are emerging out of the machine, we become subjects, and we should negate that power and go back into the flat versions. Now, The problem I have with that, I guess, is that I don't think that we are included into the assemblage of the machine before we have already emerged as subjects of desire. So I think that, and there is, the aspect of the social and the symbolic order, again, which is always fissured by antagonism, contradiction, and lack. I think that that's an aspect of how we are interpolated into subjects. But subject for me here is still very much an ethical and a radical characterization that is not a point of emergence out of the bigger machine, but it's something that you arrive at once you grasp the contradiction that exists within the social symbolic order itself. So a lot of this is a way to not try to diminish that dimension of subjectivity as an ethical and an emancipatory character. And part of that means for me that becoming subject, before you can enter into what Deleuze and Guattari called machinic enslavement, we have to already be established as desiring subjects. I think that there's a priority to being interpolated as desiring subject before we can enter into the assemblage form of machinic enslavement, very much in the way that algorithmic logic on social media platforms, for instance, operate, that we're not integrated into it until we're already existing as desiring subjects,
Right,
with a certain relation to our enjoyment. And I don't, and again, yeah. I don't know if that contrasts with other views of Deleuze and Guattari, and I'm certainly open to conversation about it.
I found without arguing about their work, because I think that to a certain extent I found persuasive your argument that by putting the priority back on subjection versus, as you said, Lazzarato, Deleuze, Guattari, and some other thinkers, you are putting back to the center this you're putting back in focus the question of the antagonism at the heart of the social, right? You're making sure that doesn't get lost. That seems to be one of the worries in this question about which has priority, is that sometimes class antagonism, class struggle can get lost or even become at best become secondary. Was I reading some of that argument correctly?
No, that makes sense. And I guess one thing I didn't finish train of thought here. When I'm talking about the function of negation in Deleuze, I think that negation is always against, the power that's pulling us out of the flat existence of the assemblage or the machine or whatever you want to call it. Whereas in Lacan and Hegel, I want to stress also that it's actually the negative, the lack, the negation is in a way a priority, right? Mm-hmm. So that I think that if you wanted to distinguish between a Lacanian approach and a Deleuzian approach, and I'm saying Deleuzian broadly because I don't mean to be excluding Guattari here, mm-hmm. Yeah. But if you wanted to think about it that way, that for Deleuze, it seems as though there's some form of a positive existence that is prior, and then we negate all the things that disrupt that. Whereas for Lacan, we negate only to come at the end to realize that there's that lack, the incompleteness of reality is what's central here, right? And that's part of the process, not just of subjection or social subjection, but also, or subjectivization, people call it sometimes, but it's really the process of the emergence of the subject as the lack in the structure. That subject is very much coinciding, overlapping with a recognition of the incompleteness to reality, incompleteness to the structure. And I actually think that's a very liberating idea here, because what it suggests is that once I reach that point of knowing that that my destiny has not been decided ahead of time, I feel like I'm channeling Doc Brown at the end of Back to the Future Part 3. My destiny hasn't been decided at time, but that gives me the freedom to act and to change the material conditions in which I exist. Right? Without guarantees. There's no guarantees that what I do is going to, resolve the tensions here, but it does say that I have the freedom to do this. And every act I do, every choice I make is also at the same time the negation of various other choices. That every time I make a choice, I'm not getting everything. I'm not returning to this plenitude of a flat material assemblage of, of whatever. But every time I choose and make a choice and act in a certain way, I'm again still losing something. I'm always still lacking something. This is one of the reasons why I say now in a lot of my work that alienation is constitutive of our freedom, that every free act always already implies the loss and being alienated from all of the other options I didn't choose. Right? So it's always the restaging of the lack or the incompleteness in material reality. I hope that makes sense.
I think so, and it kind of again brings to relief some of the arguments you make in your book, and I will agree with you that there is negation in Deleuze, because one of the before the first two positive tasks of schizoanalysis, it's about destroying, right? It's these destructions,
Exactly.
the curatage of the unconscious, as they call it.
Railing against the despotic signifier. I don't understand. I don't understand how you can see that as anything but an act of negation.
Right. The other point was I liked how you brought in Zizek with, for example, when you brought up, for example, you brought up Judith, this context in which we are left without any way out insofar as it's power and our resistance to power that subjectivizes us, but to a certain extent, you bring in Zizek, you bring in Lacan, and make this argument about interpolation. The subject appears when interpolation fails or ideology fails. I was wondering if you could. That was something that got me thinking a lot, and I'm just wondering if that kind of it extends some of the things you've said to us today, just a moment ago, about this question of navigating freedom.
Yeah, I mean, it's a simple answer. I think that typically there's a sense from Althusser forward, Foucault forward. I think that typically we think of subject as a product of ideology and power, whereas for me, reading Zizek, using Lacan to rethink Hegel, for instance, subject for me is a liberatory category. Subject is what emerges at a point of thinking emancipatory ethics, that there cannot be any kind of emancipatory ethics without a subject that emerges through a moment of failure in the ideology.
Right.
So, I mean, so that's, in very simple terms, that's where I see the difference.
Go ahead.
No, I think that there's a lot of, I guess you could even say, from Althusser's perspective, and I'm spending a lot of time thinking about Althusser's version of a structuralist Marxism versus what the critique of humanism that he has, humanism as a moral philosophy versus a kind of a structural and dialectical analysis of capitalism as a science. And I don't think that you can actually even, I try to think of humanism in the category of subject also as a scientific and ethical as opposed to moral category. Ethical in the sense of thinking about the relation between necessity and freedom. And I don't think you can have a dialectical science of ideology and power and exploitation without beginning from the position of, I guess, an ethical dimension of what is necessary for the conditions of our freedom. Now, I think that in Althusser, he might still say that that every historical moment might still interpolate us as a particular subject that wants to eliminate capitalism in one way or another. So subject is still a product of ideology, the communist ideology, I guess, maybe, I don't know, in that sense. Right. But I think that another way to read the subject via Zizek's understanding of Lacan and Hegel is to think about it not as being this product of ideology, but as reaching this moment of what in psychoanalysis in Lacan you call subjective destitution, where I've done all this job of negating every single object of desire or idea that that I think can grant me freedom. And I come to this point of realizing no idea, no object is going to complete me. No idea, no object is going to be it and finalize and bring me to this end where I no longer have to worry about anything anymore. That subject is really this point of saying, I have no other choice but to act in this necessary way, that given the conditions I have, I am obligated, if I want to preserve, or I don't have to do that, and I can come back into ideology and just be satisfied, in that way. But that's, you could say it's an unethical dimension in that process. So I think even keeping with the idea that I had before about social media as a central concept or metaphor, that you can't really get to that point unless you have a certain concept in the Hegelian sense, an idea against which you're grappling with the contradictions you're facing as a subject, right? That to me is the scientific dimension to these things. I hope that makes sense.
I think it does, and it seems like then the new structuralist is, say, taking Althusser, but giving a little bit of a twist where it seems like adding in Zizek and Lacan, traversing the fantasy is playing a role that you were kind of describing just a moment ago about sort of traversing ideology as the sole determinant of the subject.
And if I can just jump in there, because I think that the traversal of the fantasy is one of the most misunderstood categories in Lacanian psychoanalysis, because I think the idea of the traversal of the fantasy is often assumed to be, we no longer fantasize, we no longer,
Right.
Think only in terms of the fantasy. A better way to understand this idea of traversal of the fantasy is not, we get rid of the fantasy and then we're realists. The
Right.
idea of traversal of the fantasy is the acknowledgement that enjoyment only exists in the fantasy. That what you have is, and again, this goes back to this idea of the negation of limits, negation of prohibition. I'm going to get rid of these limits. I'm going to get rid of power. I'm going to get rid of prohibition. And then I'm going to have full enjoyment, which is not the case, I think, in Lacan and Hegel and Zizek. What you have is you start to grapple when you reach that point of subjective destitution. I'm the one who puts in place my own limits, my own prohibition. And by having the freedom to put in place my own limits, I can still go on enjoying in the form of the fantasy, recognizing the fact that I'll never be able to transcend that limit because I always impose it myself. And that's where real freedom lies.
Right. And I think you made this clear in several ways, but one of the ways that I really liked was this tension that Zizek points out with this perversion, right? There's this perversion of, I know very well, as you mentioned earlier, I know very well about my fantasy, and yet somehow I don't allow myself to go far enough to see that what I'm the one in control, or that as you said, enjoyment lies within the fantasy itself. It's as though there's this one last deception of, in the perverse moment, I have to push away that knowledge, or that somehow the fantasy is outside or elsewhere or not, or sort of has power over me. I'm not exactly sure a good way to put it, but
that makes a lot of sense. Right. And that's one of the reasons why I say that the analysis of social media shows us that the form that ideology takes today is one of perversion. Mm-hmm. That when we go onto social media, we're willing back into existence the big other. When we think about, all the various different friends and followers and even people we don't even know that are on there that are somehow watching us, that there's a kind of a willing back into existence, the form of the big other, because without the form of the big other, we can't enjoy in the same, our desire isn't operative in the same way without it. So we know that the big other doesn't exist when we go on social media, but we act as if it does exist because it's one of the main mechanisms for procuring our enjoyment via desire. To me, that is why social media is a great example, a great structural example for understanding the form that ideology takes, the form or the structure that ideology takes in specifically neoliberal capitalism.
I think you can see this, you can look at this in real time and see this process occurring relative to the way that Elon Musk, with his purchase of Twitter, is now considered. It's all the rage is all about, we want free speech. The free speech that they want is they want the perverse enjoyment, right? Like that's what they want. They want to be able to troll and say whatever they want, because that's how, I don't know, that's how social media structures things in the way that it appeals to a certain, I don't know if this is my kind of crackpot theory that about the drive having this indifference or this, like it doesn't really care whether the intensity is positive or negative. And a lot of times negativity is going to have a stronger libidinal charge than a positive comment. So like if someone says something nice about you on your post, sure, you get a little bit of enjoyment out of that, but it's nowhere near the palpable libidinal and energy that it gets imbued whenever you see like a terrible take. Like I see takes sometimes on Twitter that harrow my soul. Like they make me want to kill myself in a sense. Like the takes are so bad and so cruel.
So if I could just jump in there. So there's
Sure.
a few.
Yeah, no, please do.
Taylor asked me a while back now about the difference, between modernism and postmodernism. And, this is something, so I had my little book on postmodern theory and Blade Runner. So this is something that I think about quite a bit. And I guess in the psychoanalytic sense, one way you could distinguish modernism and postmodernism is if modernism enjoyment is organized around obligatory prohibition, postmodernism is organized around obligatory enjoyment. It's not only that we're permitted or free to enjoy, but we're constantly obligated to enjoy. Now, another way to think about the difference between modernism and postmodernism is if modernism is this idea, it's not just about rebellion, but it's also, constantly making it new, making it new. The ethic of modern art is constantly making it new, making it new. Don't be commodity, don't be kitsch, don't be popular culture, don't be mass culture. You constantly have to revolutionize the form, from impressionism to surrealism to abstract expressionism and so forth. Everything is about railing against the form. And you can see, obviously, that this operates in concert with the capitalist mode of production, which constantly has to undermine itself, deterritorialize and reterritorialize, right, in different ways. So that when we get to postmodernism, this is what happens when the art of resistance and rebellion and undermining becomes itself the official ideology, when it becomes the art of the gallery, the art of the museum, the art of the university, the art of criticism, that when it becomes the official art, when rebellion itself becomes the official art, when resistance itself becomes the official art, it's also becoming the official ideology. Everybody today wants to think of themselves as resisting or rebelling against something, but to do that, you have to have that perverse moment of putting something else into the position of power and authority. When somebody like Elon Musk is championing, he's this bastion of free speech, right? And, it's a complicated conversation, because I do think that I am someone who still thinks that there's importance to free speech. And I don't know, what's the cancel culture stuff, it's a longer conversation. Yeah. But, that perspective is making it look like, this, big media now mogul billionaire, he's not the authority, he's not power. The person who's telling him to be respectful to racialized minorities and so on, right? That all of a sudden that person is the big authority that we have to fight against. It's a weird situation where if everybody has to be interpolated as rebel or resistant, then the people that are being oppressed and exploited all of a sudden are made to appear rhetorically as figures of authority. Right? So it's a very, odd dynamic here.
It's a dialectical reversal, and this is why
the listeners can't see it, but I'm doing that hand gesture. Dialectical reversal.
Yeah, because you do point out that that's how there's this ironic moment where the alt-right, where conservatism, where traditional values now becomes cutting edge and rebellious, right?
And I don't want to. One other thing I want to stress here is that in saying those things, I want to emphasize that I do think that norms are important. I think that there is an important aspect of imposing norms. I think that we have to recognize that norms, however, are historical and in flux, and they change. But I think that the instituting moment of the norm can help us not just to eliminate structure, but to build the structures that we require for our freedom. Mm-hmm. And we have to recognize that every historical moment, things are constantly changing, right? Nothing is ever staying the same. I think that's a key dimension of ideological fantasy, when we think we can reach a point where everything will just be fine and dandy and end, right? Everything is changing. But I think we have to impose certain norms in order to ensure that we have a structured society that provides freedom for everyone. I think it should be a norm to say that we should not be transphobic. Right? I think that it should be a norm to say that workers shouldn't be exploited. Right? I think that norms are not always repressive against the majority. Right? I think that the question is, which norms can give us the most freedom? Right.
And I think there's an ongoing, I'll use the word since I feel like it fits here. There's an ongoing dialectic between norms and values and how they feed and impact upon each other. And so I do think that that's part of what is, when you see this call for a return to traditional values, however plagued by nostalgia and fantasy it is trying to reassert a norm that feels outdated. And so that's why I found it interesting, this question that you ask about when subversion becomes the master signifier, or the however you want to put it, the dominant. Then reactionary, traditional, the nostalgic becomes seemingly, in appearance, it becomes, rebellious. But on the other hand, you asked this interesting question, this way of putting it, about the subversion of subversion. Obviously, this ties into what we were just discussing, but I wanted to know sort of that way of putting it dialectically, maybe, but how that came to you, or how you see that sort of continuing this discussion.
I guess, I don't think it's an original
idea. Sorry, I apologize.
No, it's okay, because It's an idea that I'll be honest. I mean, it came to me a very, very long time ago. One of my favorite cultural studies books is Dick Hebdage's Subculture, The Meaning of Style.
Okay.
And in that book, he has a really good, yes, dialectical way of reading the relationship between subculture and the mainstream. Insofar as subculture it's based always on the negation of the mainstream. But if we're talking about subculture, which I think is still a product of capitalism, if we're talking about subculture in that way, we can see that in a commodified mass culture, that subculture is always constantly being diffused and reincorporated back into the mainstream,
Right.
because it's part of the rebel cell, right?
Right.
You can commodify symbols and commodities that are tied to subculture to diffuse and reintegrate the subculture back in. It's a very difficult, I mean, there's a certain threshold beyond which, the mainstream will not diffuse aspects of certain subculture that are violent and extremist. But you can also see the way that certain, I guess, social mentalities can easily be distributed and reproduced so that, different forms of subversion, they seem like they're rebelling, but they're still part of the reigning ideology. Simple example, I've already mentioned the example of the troll, but if you think about neoliberal capitalism and, again, the whole biopolitical notion of the entrepreneur of the self and the investment in human capital, that we are all encouraged to think of ourselves as little individual businesses of one, and we spend our money if we do it, according to the rational logic of the market, then we're encouraged to spend our money in a way that adds value to our human capital and builds our reputation, because that's the way in which we're going to gain access to our needs via the market, via our ability to sell our human capital as commodified labor power, and so on and so on and so on. Reputation management becomes the main way that we produce ourselves. Right. So if you think about somebody like, the figure of the troll, for instance, trolls are also in the game of reputation management, right? That their way of, building their reputation is by tarnishing the reputation of other people. So there's that, image of being a rebel, resisting, in a very, crude way or whatever, right? But it's still following the very same logic of the neoliberal entrepreneurial ethic of reputation management. And social media is one of the key spaces we see that taking place.
Yeah, I mean, I liked your discussion of this objectification of the subject with this capital S self that we build with our, as you said, with our reputation management, with our with our LinkedIn accounts and our profile pages and sort of even in grad school when I was in grad school a dozen years ago, it felt normal to talk about applying for the job market in academia as marketing yourself, right?
You got to brand yourself. You have to brand yourself.
And you have to brand yourself. Exactly. So this type of so-called necessity of creating this self that is that becomes the brand is it is one of those things where this is perhaps one of the good things about Twitter. I've talked to Cooper about this versus Facebook. Even if Twitter allows for more anonymous trolling, there is a sense of not everyone wants to have their face and their identity linked to their ability to interact on this platform. That's what Facebook is for. If you want that type of above board self, then there are platforms for it. But there is too a kind of freedom in that anonymity. And you discussed this too in this question of being perceptible, being imperceptible, this question of surveillance and share valence, which I really appreciated and thought was fascinating. So I don't really have a question here, I guess. I'm just kind of, you're getting the cogs in the wheels spinning for me.
The best cogs in the wheels spinning that I love about when I wrote this book, I finished the book and I thought to myself, I'm using the lure of social media. And really, I'm talking about philosophy and theory.
Right.
In all seriousness, I think it depends on what we want to get out of our use of social media, because, let's not kid around. I know that, we use, some of us, our real identities, our real names on these platforms. Many of us also use, what is it called, a burn account, right? Where you can hide your identity and you can act and say things that, and it affords you a degree of freedom. Absolutely. I don't know if I have a real, if anything I say about this right now is going to be a spontaneous thought. But I think that's also, again, another way of showing the dilemmas of the kind of freedom that we're taught about in a liberal and capitalist society, which is really not freedom at all. Right? Because I think that what it shows us is that there's a big lack of trust, right? I don't think you can have genuine, authentic freedom and open and rational critical debate. And I'm not just saying this in a utopian Habermasian sense, right? The public use of reason, you have to have the private use of reason, the public use of reason, that you do have to have an ability to establish a form of trust that allows you to be able to reason freely in the public. I guess another way to think about this, and I've been thinking about this more and more recently, is the difference between the form of the big other in Lacan and the form of the analyst. Because one of the things that you see in Zizek's work in particular is trying to show that real emancipation depends on not the relationship to the grand autre, big other, but to the petit autre, the small other of the analytical relationship. I think it's useful to think about that in terms of the movement from the, very famous, I think too famous, dialectic of the Lord and Bondsman in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, to the very small sections where he talks about love in the section of family in Philosophy of Right. And I think that there's an argument to be made about the movement from the big other to the small other, from the grand autre to petit autre, in terms of the movement from the Lord and Bondsman to the love relationship in the family section in Philosophy of Right. Because what you're getting in the Lord and Bondsman dialectic is that moment of making sure that you are recognized by the figure of the big other, right? When you want to gain your self-consciousness is a product of having yourself acknowledged by the big other in that situation. And that's what I think is happening on social media, trying to gain the attention, trying to gain the awareness of, notice me, recognize me, see me, right? This is always what's happening. I'm almost singing a song from Tommy, I know. But then the real moment of transition is to move into that relationship of the love relationship. And there's something that I think, Lacan kind of talks about this in his eighth seminar on the transference, that there's something about the not romantic love, but there's a love relationship in the analytical relationship, insofar as you're able to, with this, you choose one other person, right? Not all the big other, but one person into whom you give your trust. You say what you want openly, freely, the free association is possible, right? And in that process of doing that, you allow yourself to see the lacking in yourself via its objectification in the figure of the small other. And by doing that, you build a sense of trust. And in building a sense of trust, you gain a sense of self-awareness and freedom that then permits you to go into the public and to, with that sense of, gain that feeling of security and trust that allows you to engage in real critical and rational debate. Now, on the one hand, I'm saying that I think that we'd all benefit from having that kind of analytical relationship. It doesn't necessarily have to be in psychoanalysis. It can be in having a love relationship with some other person that allows you to have that kind of freedom. But I think we also have to remember that so many of us, this is impossible because of the material conditions of capitalist exploitation. And this is something that gets amplified by social media. We're not able to have these kinds of relationships because our material lives are constantly undermined by the system that exploits and puts downward pressure on us and stress and anxiety, right? So this is not conducive. This is not a situation that's conducive to free and fair and open debate and dialogue, so that when you're in grad school, you feel comfortable being able to make a valid, genuine, legitimate, and, fair critique of people who are senior to you. I mean, why shouldn't we want this? I don't blame a lot of people. I was in that situation too at one point, right? There's a fear of doing it because it will impact your ability to support yourself. So these are all ways that, I guess the goal of the book is really to show how if you begin with an analysis of social media, you ultimately end up as a critique of capitalism.
That's the other part of the vehicle, right? It's not just that it's a book that seems like it's about social media, but it's actually philosophy and whatnot. It's a book that seems like it's about social media, but in fact is sort of putting front and center the class struggle, putting front and center the social antagonism inherent in social media, right? It's that problematization of the social in social media was what I thought was a nice way to transition from beginning to end. And that's kind of what I was left with thinking about after reading, was this sort of pushing towards that antagonism inherent in that we're still sort of left with. And some of that along the way, I appreciated bringing in this aspect of capitalist realism where so much, and Zizek does this too, and he's not the only one, but so much of the current, as you know, as a film buff and a film theorist and film critic, you know how many movies are about the end of the world. And so this notion, it's easier to think of the end of the world than the end of capitalism, and that rationally speaking, from the dominant form of rationality, it seems like any alternative to capitalism is itself irrational, right? Because it's antagonistic to those, to the class interests of the powers that be, or however you want to phrase it. So formulating your book that way and having those different threads gave a lot of added value than something that would have potentially been quote unquote objectively neutral from some sort of, that would be a fantasy position to participate in, right? That would be the highest ideological gesture, that you could have an objective analysis. And I say objective with scare quotes around it, right? Because you pointed out, even in the algorithms, right, they're sort of infused with ideology, because there's always a terminus and a sort of origin point through human sort of spheres. It's not the algorithm sounds like it's completely asubjective and ahuman, but it's sort of infused with desire, if you want to use that term broadly.
Yeah, and it's infused with human desire, because I mean, these are tools that absolutely are organized and programmed with human social and political interest always implied. Now, one of the things I don't want to give the impression is, I don't believe that I'm a techno-utopianist, and I don't believe that I'm a techno-dystopianist.
Right.
Because what I think always within a Marxist framework technology allows us to do is to gain knowledge of our material conditions and our political conditions, that the technology is never neutral, let's say, but what it does is it opens up a window for us to understand the material conditions and the political conditions in which we're living. And there's a couple of things here, right? One is, I say I'm not a techno-dystopian because, and part of the reason why I say I want to accelerate the social media metaphor, not only for the imminent critique, but also to recognize that in different material and political conditions, the technologies that we've developed, and this is, I guess, it's a very traditional Marxist perspective, that fragment of machines, you say, right? That the technologies we built in capitalism can put to different social and political uses, can be a wing in our emancipation. And I speak from a very personal perspective here, because you may have noticed from time to time, I'm putting my cell phone to my shoulder. I'm a type 1 diabetic. And what I'm doing is I'm using my mobile phone to check my blood sugar. I have a sensor that is attached to my arm, and it checks my blood sugar. And there's technology in development right now to link a glucometer, like the one on my mobile phone, to an insulin pump via cloud technology. And a technology, we talk about, something like the Lacanian Latou's, right? But it's a technology that is being organized and developed as an artificial pancreas that is relying on cloud technology, algorithmic media, mobile new media, and so on and so forth. And this is absolutely an enabling aspect of the technology that's being developed in the same way within capitalism, right? So it's an example of, again, the forces of production outgrowing the relations of production. Absolutely. But in terms of, the dystopian utopian framework, there have been moments when I have thought that not utopia, but dystopia is actually a much more liberatory form of narrative, if we think about it in the context of, and I wouldn't necessarily put it this way, but here I'll say, if we think about it in the terms of the Freudian troglodyte, right, backwards and retroactivity, that if you think about retroactivity, if you're imagining the future, even the capitalist realist, it's easier to imagine the end of the world, the end of capitalism kind of sense, then we're imagining the future as lacking. We're seeing the lack in the future, which retroactively brings us to the position of the present, that in order to be able to see the lack in the present, we have to imagine the lack in the future. Just think about the future as this shithole society, understanding it that way, that we can think about, holy shit, right now is the really shithole society. There's the lack in the existing form. There's always there always is, I want to stress, always is this dimension of lack. But the question is what is to be done, right?
Yeah.
And if we construct the narrative, retroactively in that sense, and if we see that the technologies that are being developed within capitalism do have this liberatory, emancipatory potential, then it helps us to create this sense of narrative, right? Again, back to Jameson's cognitive mapping, always historicize. It gives us a sense of what is necessary to enhance the freedoms that we aspire towards, right? This is a key thing, that we shouldn't just, dismiss liberal and bourgeois conceptions of freedom and equality. We should try to actualize them and make them material, right? This is what I think has to be done.
I like that. I think that gives, and you brought up Latouche, which I know when Cooper and I were first discussing it, we called it, we're Southern boys, so we called it Lat House, because I wasn't thinking about
I like that.
The Lat House.
I'm gonna have to say it that way from now on.
Yeah, but I know, Coop, you've been. I know this is something you've been fascinated about. You may have had a question about the Latouche, which gets brought up a few times in your book, Matthew.
Yeah, I definitely do. I want to even maybe go back to something interesting that Nick Land says about capital with regard to this, I think, is that capital is escape, capital is deterritorialization. So anytime that you're trying to get outside of capital, you're doing capital, which is the really insidious aspect of it. And you can kind of like look through this through the lens of our podcast, because what are we doing? Yeah, I guess we are sort of providing some type of voice against the capitalist, hegemonic capitalism to some degree, right? But in so doing, we are consuming products, we're participating in the market, we're engaging in reputation management, etc. We're trying to build a brand, even though we know very well.
Don't hate the player, hate the game.
Right? Obviously, we know very well, and yet, because there is a question of what does one do when perversion, when escape is part of the machine itself, like whenever it can negate your negation faster than you can even develop it, because it's always sort of one step ahead of our desire, because it's sort of feeding our desire. And when you're attaching this to something like a global communications network and algorithms, etc., then that becomes even a further barrier that we have to sort of break through. So it's like sort of wind up at this sort of stalemate, because capitalism can always sort of develop these new axiomatics to capture your revolutionary desire and cordon it off and prevent it from spilling over into the social field. I don't know if you have a response to that at all.
I do have a response, and I think that my first response. Well, you said a lot of things, so I'm going to say that.
Sure, please do.
So the first thing is, this is why I think, and even within the history of Marxism at various different points, if we go beyond just, again, the critique of political economy, I don't think that we can transform or make our society more liberated. We can't emancipate if we're only focusing on the mode of production, because I think that all change is going to have to take place at the political level to change the law, if you want to put it that way, right? And I guess the way this is, again, where, and maybe you disagree, but this is where I have a critique of Deleuze and Guattari. Even if you want to take it, I don't know how far you want to go with this, but the accelerationist argument of, accelerate to the limits. What is the, accelerate, push beyond its limits so it implodes, if we're talking about Nick Land or whomever, right? That's the idea. Whereas I think that still follows the logic of desire, constant negation. And you're always just trying to destroy the structure. My argument is no more destroying the structures. We have to impose limits. We have to create new forms of prohibition. We have to create new norms. we have to create new structures, new laws, and so on and so forth. That it's by, as I said before, that when we're traversing the fantasy, the whole idea is realizing that I have the freedom to impose limits, and then my enjoyment is strictly in the fantasy. And I think that collective action and class struggle is this process of determining what are the norms, what are the laws, what are the limits, what are the prohibitions that we want to put in place as part of our project of universal emancipation. So that's one thing I would say, that we still have to engage. And this is why I think that the concept in the Hegelian sense is important, because the concept or the metaphor, as I put it, is the rhetorical dimension by which we come to some sense of mutual consensus around the prohibition, the laws, the norms we want to build. No more destruction. My friend Anna Kornblue is very good in her book, The Order of Forms. No more politics of destruction. We have to build structures. This is what Lacan is doing too. When in the analytical relationship, you produce the new master signifier that gives new structure, a new framework to the way in which we're grasping the conditions in which we're living. Not necessarily material change, but we change the way we understand the material conditions, and then we can act. Now, the other thing you said, I mean, this is kind of a pet peeve of mine, so I don't mean to put it on you.
No worries.
But I have a problem, and it comes out of Marx too, because I think that Marx is wrong in his early writing and even in his later writing in Capital, in his understanding of the negation of the negation. Because I think that there's a much too linear understanding of the negation of the negation. You notice I've been saying quite a bit that this logic of desire follows this process of negation, 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 negation. I get an object, I think the object is it, but it's not it. I want to go to the next one. Negation, negation, negation. And every time I'm doing that, I'm also at the same time imposing the power that's prohibiting me, outside of me, external to me, right? That there's the external determination, or the external reflection, right? Every time I negate, I'm externalizing my lack onto some figure of the other. And negation of the negation, or the determinate negation, right, is that moment of then I come back, I'm not just always negating, I'm realizing that I'm the one who created the prohibition in the first place. I'm the one who put in the limit. So there's a cyclical dimension to it, right? Not a linear progression of history, but it's that subjective moment of realizing that I'm the one who has the power to impose that limit, to create the structures of my freedom and my liberation. Now, I want to say that this is also at the same time for me a kind of a self-critique, because one thing that I do this in the chapter on the love algorithm, where we're talking about the swipe left, swipe right, that we have that relation to this, into our enjoyment in terms of a relation of affirmation of the phallic order, or the negation of the phallic order, if we're talking about it in terms of the feminine and the masculine logic. And my self-critique is that I think that I realized after the fact that it's much too Maoist. It's a much too Maoist understanding of the logic of negation and affirmation, because one of the things Mao will say, and again, he's drawing off of, relation to, response to, in some ways, to Stalin, who is also in some ways responding to Engels. And I don't want to lay it all on Engels, because I don't think it's Engels' fault. But there's all this talk, taking away the logic of the negation of negation. Mao says that, there's no such thing as the negation of the negation. There's just affirmation and negation, affirmation and negation. And I don't think that I'm as explicit enough in the social media book in talking about how the negation of the negation is an important subjective dimension to thinking about the process of our liberation. It's only in the moment of the negation of negation that we can arrive at some kind of consensus around an historical concept that allows us to develop the kind of immanent critique we require and the imposition of new structure and framework of our liberation. So it's a small pet peeve, but I think that a lot of work still needs to be done on rethinking the category of negation of negation, which is something that I'm trying to do in some of my more recent work. And I think it starts with Marx. I think that in the philosophical notebooks, 1844, and then, of course, near the end of Capital in the primitive accumulation section, I think that it's too much of a linear conception of the negation of the negation. Linear, again, in the sense that, when we talk about the flipping, Marx flips Hegel on his head, so he might think with his feet. If you think about it as inverted triangles, that his argument is that Hegel starts from the heavens, then goes down to earth, and then the negation of the negation is to go up back into the heavens for Hegel, whereas for Marx, you begin with the material, you negate, and you go back up to the heavens, and then you negate again, and you go back down to the material reality. I think it's far too linear. I think that if you read it in the beginning of Hegel's Science of Logic, that what we're talking about is a true infinity that is in the form of the circle, where you go out and you negate and you return back to your point of origin, but with another new perspective.
This might be a good place to discuss your current writings? Because you've already intimated some of that, which you said there was a kind of a new engagement with humanism. And I suppose this is involved in your current studies with returning to Hegel and looking at the negation of the negation. So is that sort of part of your current project at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to say at an earlier point in our conversation, I was talking about Althusser, that I can't remember if it was Zizek or maybe Todd McGowan said this to me, or maybe I just made it up and I didn't hear anything. This is my yesterday. But I think that, a good way to think about Lacan, maybe other people have said it, that Lacan, there's almost a useful, coincidence or mixing of Levi-Strauss and Sartre. That if you think, part of what I feel like I'm doing, even with new structuralism, is thinking about the element of the subject as it's, emerges in the structure. And it was really, a lot of my reading and critique of post-humanism that really got me onto this. And of course, not without Zizek's influence, because, one thing that people don't acknowledge about Zizek's work enough is how good he is at reading the historical conjuncture. I remember, I guess maybe it was 2010, maybe a little earlier around then, that, I was talking to, he started asking me questions about new materialism, and I had no idea what he was talking about. Like, I had read some of that plus, but I really, in his critique of post-humanism, but I really didn't know, the way he was trying to reframe dialectical materialism as a useful challenge to a lot of the so-called new materialisms, right? And it's interesting to me because a lot of my rethinking of a dialectical humanism draws very much on Zizek's work. And he and I have debated this. He has a point where in his new book, Surplus Enjoyment, where he challenges me on my category of humanism, and I have a retort that's coming out, very friendly exchange. But a lot of what I'm trying to do is I think that there's a huge mistake in a lot of the Hegelian Marxist humanisms of the 20th century, that if you look at somebody like Lefebvre or Erich Fromm, I think that you get better work, I think, in the work of Raya Danayevskaya and in early Herbert Marcuse. But I think that a lot of the 20th century Marxist humanisms, were Hegelian influenced Marxist humanisms, we're still thinking about this, negation of the negation and the recombination of some kind of closed totality, some kind of closed whole that does reach, the end of history. The influence of Kojève, of course, or even around the same time, like Lukács in different ways, who totally ignores the dialectics of nature, which I think is a huge mistake. And I think that it's worth rethinking, the late Engels. You guys had a great episode on rethinking Engels' dialectics of nature. I think that there's a very important humanist dimension to this that has been ignored, in the sense that, Engels will say I think it's in On to Düring, that, it's a classic example that freedom has no necessity. This is part of the way that he's understanding the dialectics of nature. But my framework, and thinking about it in terms of a science and not as a moralism, right, is to think about how all of our projects of freedom have to in some ways involve centering human needs and human subjectivity. And that doesn't mean to the exclusion of the non-human, because you cannot have a thriving and free human culture and society, a global human thriving society, if we don't take care of our natural conditions. Right. Now, one of the things I don't want to do is ontologize nature, because I think that nature is a biophysical necessity and not necessarily an ontological necessity. I worry that by making nature into an ontological necessity, we end up doing part of what Stalin was doing in, arguing that, the reflection theory, that we're just, as good communists, Stalin would say, we're just reflecting what what is necessary in nature. For me, it's important to think the difference, because I think ontologically, we have to understand our environment, not just nature, but our environment, as produced by us and also incomplete. I think that the ontological understanding of an incomplete reality gives us the freedom we require to act ethically without guarantees. There's no natural logic of history that we're all just doing the good work of history. Nobody knows. We have to understand, in every given historical condition, we have to act and think out of what is necessary in that moment. But for me, a dialectical humanism means thinking about what universal human needs do we center and privilege in the way in which we're going to structure and frame all of the building of the conditions that we need. And so much of that still involves thinking about what's good for the environment, what's good for the non-human animals and so forth. It doesn't mean that we have to equally think the value of everything, because look, we've just come out of this, crazy, we're still in it, right? In many different ways, the COVID-19 pandemic,
Yep.
right? I don't care, sorry to COVID-19, but I don't want to, give you equal living and longevity here, right? I'm sorry to people who might disagree, but I'm going to center human needs and human interests in that situation.
You did have a nice section in your book in Algorithmic Desire, where you discuss some of this, and maybe part of the genesis is already latent in there, where you sort of disagree with the move that we see in some of the movements that I talked about earlier in assemblage theory, for example, in sort of decentering anthropocentrism, which there are perhaps, you've cultivated in a certain way, as you've already said, because it's not a human supremacy that you're after, obviously. But on the other hand, the downside is anthropomorphizing nature and objects to a certain extent, right? And so you kind of make this other gesture where it's like, no, we should keep the anthropocentrism, be it widely, varied and nuanced from just classical forms. But I like that you're kind of, you've already said it, that it's not about anthropomorphizing objects and sort of giving them equal status, but it is about keeping an equity, I think, for these non-human objects, and realizing that, yes, while humans don't necessarily need to sort of promote themselves as the sort of height of reason or rationality, and these other kind of classical forms of human supremacy, if I could just use that term. But you still think that, obviously, if class struggle is the vector through which I think your thought is continuing with, and that has to take on an anthropocentric form, otherwise it also becomes jettisoned and secondary, right?
You're right. I think that it's wrong to think of anthropocentrism as a form of human suprematism. I think that also what people talk about in terms of anthropocentrism or in critiques of humanism are really talking about a critique of Eurocentrism or ethnocentrism or phallocentrism. And I think that the problem is that, this is one of the things I love actually in Althusser's work, that he has a great essay on Marx and Freud, where he shows that what Marx and Freud are both doing is grappling with the contradictions of bourgeois society and bourgeois subjectivity. That Marx's project is to show that society is not organized around individual action and individual freedom, that class struggle is the motor of history. Freud is also trying to show that it's not the individual ego that is the master in its own house, but that the unconscious is also an objective driving force of human action. So we're always already decentered.
Yes.
Right? We're always already decentered. So if you're always already decentered, our political project has to be one of centering the subject. The subject, and doesn't mean, to the exclusion of everyone, but we have to center a certain set of ideas and arguments and values. Freedom, reciprocity, care, these are human concepts and they're historical concepts, right? These are concepts that have developed in the tradition of secular humanism. And as a universalist, dialectical and universal humanism is, I think, the way we have to go. So it's not just a Eurocentric humanism. It's grappling with the fact that if we're going to be universal, we have to be able to bring into the framework of the totality the various different needs. When I say equity, right, as opposed to equality, the sociological category of equity, we're talking about how different people with different bodies in different places in the world have different needs. And our goal should be to recognize and realize the different needs of everyone so that we arrive at an equality of outcome. And this, to me, has been very much a part of the historical project of secular humanism. And my goal is to think about it scientifically and dialectically, but also in terms of universality. No one is free unless we are all free, I think should be our motto. Now, we'll talk about anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism. I think that a lot of new materialist and post-humanist discourse is arguing for anthropomorphism as a strategy to get out of anthropocentrism. And I can't see how that's possible if we
Mhm.
are still centering human qualities. When we anthropomorphize, we're still centering the figure of the human and applying it to the non-human. I don't
Right.
see how there's anything that is non-anthropocentric in that perspective.
Right.
So my argument is that not in a sense of a philosophical anthropology as opposed to ontology, but that in some ways the route to thinking ontologically and ethically is via reading the historical understanding of anthropocentrism. I hope that makes sense.
That does. That actually really does. And it kind of nicely ties together some of those threads that were in your recent book. So I kind of see a continuity then going.
Absolutely, definitely. I mean, it's there. I mean, I wrote the introduction. That was the last thing I wrote.
Okay.
Right? So it's very much, I'm already starting that moment. I'm already starting to think about these things. That was really where it was like, okay, this is where it's going to continue. And the beginnings in the introduction, I'm grappling with new materialism, posthumanism, accelerationism, and that's really the beginning of what'll hopefully, at some point, be the next book.
And I like that you wrote the intro last, because I always tell my students that that's what they should do. I just think that that's the best way of doing it. I mean, you can start writing in the middle, but if you write it last, you've already got a vision of the whole. I think, am I wrong? Doesn't Hegel say something about, like, if you've understood the preface to the phenomenology, you've kind of understood the whole. So there's something to that. I know we've had you 2 hours, Matthew, and I appreciate your time, but I don't want to cut out my co-host. I definitely know he may have had a question or two on Baudrillard, but I will rest my case. So, Coop, I hand it over to you, my friend.
Sure, yeah, as long as we're not keeping you. I guess maybe one thing we kind of talked a little bit about some of these other issues, but maybe you could bring into a little bit stronger relief what role you see the symbolic playing, just because I want to kind of like maybe bounce this a little bit off of Baudrillard says, which I think is not that different from kind of what I was describing relative to Nick Land, but I just would like to get your take on this, and I'll read from Symbolic Exchange and Death for the audience. We will not destroy the system by a direct dialectical revolution of the economic or political infrastructure. Everything produced by contradiction will only feed back into the machine and give it impetus, following a circular distortion similar to a Mobius strip. We will never defeat it by following its own logic of energy, calculation, reason, and revolution. We must therefore displace everything into the sphere of the symbolic, where challenge, reversal, and overbidding are the law, so that we can respond to death only by an equal and superior death. This is not coming from a sort of antagonistic. I just want to kind of like work through how you see this symbolic in contrast to Baudrillard's reading. And I think you may have done some of this work already, but
no, it's a really good question. And I have, I guess you could say, a complicated relation, or in our relationship status, it's complicated because I really appreciate some of his earliest work on the consumer society,
right.
Some of the work that's influenced by Guy Debord, who's been a figure. It doesn't come through in this book, but Guy Debord and the Situationists have always been very fascinating and interesting to me. So Baudrillard's, jumping off of that work has always been fascinating to me, I guess. And again, I'm sure some might disagree with me. There's something, I guess, there's a limit to me in this kind of reading from Baudrillard that I worry is too nihilistic. And I don't know where to go from there, right? And I still love his work as somebody trained in media and communication studies. His concept of hyperreality and the way in which he's thinking about representation are still very important to me and very interesting in the way that I conceptualize the cultural logic of postmodernism, right? That there's something about the fragmented reality in the hyperreal that I think is tied to the Jameson notion of the breakdown of the signifying chain.
Mm-hmm.
The loss of the referent is the key,
right.
Dimension of this. In terms of the symbolic, I guess, again, building off of Jameson, especially in his postmodernism work, I think that there's two useful ways to think about the symbolic in the Lacanian sense. One is, of course, the symbolic order of the big other, the field of language, meaning, authority, and so on. But I think we also have to think the symbolic in terms of the process of the talking cure and the form of narrative construction. That what the symbolic also does is it create in the process, the rhetorical process of creating narrative, it does accomplish that moment of cognitive mapping where I have to narrativize, right? I have to interpret, right? The symbolic is also key to interpretation here, that it's by interpreting and narrativizing and establishing the concept in the Hegelian sense, that's only by doing that I can gain a sense of the ethical dimensions of my situation. A good way to think about what I really want to do is to apply all of this to thinking, the big Leninist question of what is to be done. I think it's an ethical project, right? And I want to distinguish, again, in the Hegelian sense, between morality, Moralität, and Sittlichkeit. I can't say that properly. Sittlichkeit. My German is horrible, right? But ethics, right? Ethics in the sense of not what we ought to do, but ethics in the sense of what is necessary, right? What is necessary for us to do. So when I look at that passage in Symbolic Exchange and Death, I see he's coming up to a deadlock. We reach this deadlock, and he's almost in some ways undermining the deadlock, saying there's not really much we can do because, is this, will always just be reincorporated back into the system, that all dialectical contradictions will always just be brought back into the political and the economic infrastructure. I think that's a limited way of thinking about history because things are always changing. Things are always changing all the time. That's something that if in my own humanist approach, that we have to think things are changing all the time. To what extent are we capable of getting into the driver's seat of the train of history? We have to be the ones getting in the driver's seat in the train of history. And I think that we have to rethink the category of planning in a way that's different from the kind of economism you see in Stalinism, the Stalinian deviation in the Soviet Union. But I think that in terms of the accelerationist project, Mikhail Rozowski and Lee Phillips, The People's Republic of Walmart, I think is a superb book because it shows us again the way that the technologies emerging out of 21st century capitalism are helping us to rethink our ability to have democratic planning, socialist democratic planning in another new way. I don't think that we can think this without any kind of democratic planning that, again, puts us in the driver's seat of history, the train of history. So that's how I think it. And it's not because I feel antagonistic towards Baudrillard. I'm very appreciative of so much of his work. I just worry that this kind of perception leads us only down a kind of a form of immobilization. And when we feel the stress and the pressure and the anxiety of the system, because it's so heavy and weighs down on us in this way, I think this is another way in which the capitalist ideology is winning. It's the capitalist realism that's coming back into it. I can't do anything, so I just have to grin and bear it or just regress into my own little space and die sad and alone or whatever. Right. So I worry.
The perverts discourse or whatever of I know very well or the fetishes of I know very well and yet,
But even, more than just perversion, I think that there's a dimension of obsessional neurosis here, because the whole problem of obsessional neurosis in some way is that I'm never able to act because I'm so self-reflexive of everything I do. I can see how my efforts are always going to be fraught.
The Hamlet problem. To be or not to be, of course, right? I guess maybe that's the question. Maybe that's the question that Baudrillard is asking with Symbolic Exchange and Death: to be or not to be. But that's another deviation.
My only addition to this is when Baudrillard says, when the system gives us back little deaths in the form of wages or whatever, I have to wager my spectacular and immediate death. That's the only thing that can't be counter-gifted. I kind of think to myself, yeah, okay, sure, you go first, right? That's part and parcel of the nihilism, right? Because as you're kind of saying, the limit is literally just throwing yourself sort of into the abyss.
One thing just to add here, right?
Yes.
And I think Alenka Zupancic is wonderful on this point, is really when we're talking about the symbolic, understanding the way in which the signifier falls into the signified. Even if you think about, and it's an important lesson to learn about the program of narrative construction and interpretation, that when we are thinking objects, we are constructing them in the form of the symbolic. When we think about nature, for instance, nature is an abstract category that only exists for us. It's brought to our conscious, not just that it only exists. I mean, of course, it has material existence, but as an object of consciousness, it only exists for us at the level of discourse. When the symbolic here, the signifier is entering into the signified in this way, so that when we conceive it as an object of consciousness in the form of the symbolic, that allows us to think about the ethical dimensions of what we should do about nature. this is how, for me, the symbolic can operate at this level of narrative construction and interpretation, insofar as it allows us to think about the material implications of our action on the object.
That was my real question, was like, okay, given this position of the real is sort of foreclosed, what are the sort of mechanisms, what can we mobilize in the symbolic? If that's the case, if the sort of real is foreclosed, what powers or what opportunities are there in the symbolic? So you kind of anticipated what I really wanted to get to anyways.
Excellent.
And I mean, again, when we say the real is foreclosed, I don't know if that's how I would want to frame it.
Right. I guess I would say the real.
That's how I would say it because I'm partial to Laura Well, but go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, I mean, I was just going to say,
ignore my bad terminology.
I mean, I guess this is where, for me, the symbolic is important, right? Because language, has legs. but I guess I would say that for me, I mean, my understanding, and again, I read Lacan very much through Zizek's Hegelian interpretation, and I think that it's important to think the real as something similar to the form of the contradiction, where the real only emerges at the limit points of the symbolic. The real emerges at the level of the contradiction that we grasp in the symbolic. This is the very important distinction between the move from Kant to Hegel, that in the antinomies of pure reason, what Kant sees as a limitation, Hegel sees as a positive condition of existence. It's not that contradiction prevents us from knowing, but the contradiction is a material condition of existence and reality. So when we grasp it, that's when we see the real emerging at the limit point of the symbolic. So I wouldn't say that the real is foreclosed. I'd say that the real represents, or it emerges at the limit of the symbolic, at the point of contradiction in the symbolic.
That's good. And that's food for thought, I think, because that's going to keep us thinking. And honestly, Matthew, I appreciated your book. I appreciated you working through some of this with us, and the sort of the passion and the energy you brought, because that kind of stuff is, if you could bottle it, you could make a fortune on it. I know that's not maybe your goal, but
if you could make a fortune doing philosophy in this way, I would really like to know. It's been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed having this conversation, guys. And I'm sorry if, I know I talk a lot, so.
But see, this is
it's about the guest for us. I
mean, for us, it's about the guest. For us, it's just about a forum for you to talk about the things you're passionate about. I mean, you're obviously passionate about it if you write a book on it, I think, unless, you're some sort of masochistic enjoyment in posting cringe, which I do think that's like the opposite of the troll, right? Is the ones who want attention and post the worst takes. So, but I didn't see your book in that light, but I do think that what we try to do is allow for our guests to speak. And in a certain way, you have to do the hard work. We just get to kind of set up little softballs for you.
Yeah, exactly.
But we all get a little bit of enjoyment out of it. And thanks for making time for us today.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the episode will be out in 2 weeks. So we'll be in touch and let you know when it drops. And I'm looking forward to the work you've got in store, because you've already got me thinking sort of along the tracks you set, and so I'm looking forward to seeing what you put out there in the future.
Thanks. It's been a real pleasure. I've had a lot of fun doing this, guys.
So thanks again. We're gonna stick around for a minute, but we'll let you go and enjoy your weekend. Okay.
Yeah. Have a great Friday.
All right. You too, guys. All right. Take it easy. Thanks again. Bye.
And that will wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. The whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.